At last, a crisp, bright November day, after what seems like week after week of endless gloom and rain. We find ourselves on this chilly day in the Northumbrian village of Warkworth, a village steeped in hundreds of years of tumultuous history. A walk along the streets of this beautiful village brings us to the Church of St. Lawrence, the stories of which date back to the year 737 AD, when King Ceolwulf of Northumbria gifted the village and its church to the monks of Lindisfarne. Throughout its history, the church served as more than just a place of worship, but also a place of security and sanctuary against enemy invasion. Sadly, on Saturday the 13th of July in the year 1174, it failed in that historical role when Duncan, Earl of Fife, besieged the village of Warkworth and butchered some 300 villagers who were taking refuge in the church. This was the darkest day in the village's history. Before heading to the castle and exploring its ruins, which sit in an elevated position above the village with the North Sea as a backdrop, we head to the nearby beach with the dogs to enjoy the bracing air and golden sands. Dogs exercised and content, it's time to head back up to the village and the impressive Warkworth Castle, an historic location used by William Shakespeare as a setting in his plays Henry IV Parts 1 and 2. More of that later. The castle sits in a naturally defensive position in the loop of the River Coquet, which reaches the North Sea at Warkworth Harbour. The first written records of Warkworth Castle were in a charter of 1157 to 1164, when King Henry II granted it, along with the manor of Warkworth, to Roger Fitz-Eustace. At that time the castle was made out of timber and considered feeble, so much so that Roger didn't even bother to defend it in 1173 when the Scots invaded. The villagers instead used the aforementioned church as their place of refuge. Roger's son, Robert, later inherited the castle and in 1199 paid 300 marks for royal confirmation of his ownership of the castle and the manor of Warkworth. Robert Fitzroger became increasingly active in Northumberland. He was a favourite of King John, and in 1203 was made Sheriff of Northumberland, becoming quite a powerful royal official. In the year 1213, a year before his death, he received the king as a guest at Warkworth Castle. It is likely that much of the castle, as we see it today, is largely down to the input of Robert Fitzroger between the years of 1199 and 1214. During the First Anglo-Scottish Wars, Robert's great-grandson had the castle, but he and his son, John, were captured by the Scots in 1297 after the English defeat at the Battle of Stirling. Later, John, known as John de Clavering, took over the estates, but in 1311 handed over the inheritance of all his properties to the king. Why, you may well ask? Well, in a word, debt. In fact, in 1317 he admitted owing the huge sum of £600 to an Italian merchant. That's around £328,000 in today's money. Warkworth was a well-defended castle, being provided with extra men at arms and light cavalry by the king in 1319, and in 1327 it was, unsuccessfully, besieged by the Scots. This brings us to the famed Percy family, who took over the castle in 1328 when King Edward III granted Warkworth to Henry, 2nd Lord Percy. The Percys were emerging as one of the most influential families in the north of England, and their main holding was at Alnwick Castle, a few miles down the road. Warkworth, however, became a favoured residence for them, and somewhat of an architectural showpiece. During their tenure, 2 residential complexes of supreme quality and sophistication were built. Lord Percy's grandson, also Henry, was the first Earl of Northumberland, a sign of his status and power in the border region. He was in fact the first great landowner in the north to obtain such a noble title, and he transformed Warkworth Castle, adding to it the Great Tower. The Earl played an active role in deposing Richard II after Richard elevated his rival, Richard Neville, to Earl of Westmoreland, in Shakespeare's version of events. That you read these accusations and the grievous crimes committed by your person and your followers against the state and profit of this land, that by confessing them, the souls of men may deem that you are worthily deposed. Henry and his son, Harry Hotspur, supported the rebellion of Henry Bolingbroke and became King Henry IV. First, to thy sacred state wish I all happiness. His love for Henry IV was not to last, however, and in 1403 the Earl and Harry Hotspur turned against the king, continuing to conspire against him until Hotspur was killed at the Battle of Shrewsbury. Again in Shakespeare's words, Hotspur laments, "O Harry, thou hast robbed me of my youth. I better brook the loss of brittle life than those proud titles thou hast won of me. They wound my thoughts worse than sword my flesh, but thought's the slave of life, and life time's fool, and time, that takes survey of all the world, must have a stop. Oh, I could prophesy, but that the earthy cold hand of death lies on my tongue. No, Percy, thou art dust." Harry's father, the Earl, fled to Warkworth, where he was arrested, and an attempt was made to seize his assets. This was made difficult, however, by Percy's 14-year-old son declaring himself a royal subject, and saying that, unfortunately, he had none of the ceremonial trappings necessary to forfeit the castle formally to the king. Unbelievably, this ploy worked, and the Percy family retained control of the castle. The Earl even had his title restored in 1404. This was almost certainly a mistake on the king's part, as the Earl had no loyalty to him and joined a conspiracy led by Archbishop Scrope in 1405. King Henry, however, crushed Scrope's rebellion and marched north with an army. Percy fled to Scotland, and whilst the captain of Warkworth Castle attempted to defend it against the king, after 7 shots were fired from the king's cannon, the garrison cried for mercy and sued for peace. Following this, the castle was intermittently occupied by one of Henry IV's younger sons, John of Lancaster, who served as warden of the East March, but after Henry V succeeded to the throne, the son of Harry Hotspur, another Henry Percy, was restored to the family inheritance. He was the 2nd Earl of Northumberland and resided in Warkworth. In 1455 he was killed fighting for the Lancastrian cause at the Battle of St Albans at the beginning of the War of the Roses. His son died a few years later at the Battle of Towton. In 1462, Yorkist forces led by the Earl of Warwick besieged the castles of Bamborough, Alnwick and Dunstanburgh simultaneously, and Warwick used Warkworth Castle as his Yorkist headquarters. He rode out from there daily to supervise various nearby sieges. Following this, King Edward IV gave the title of Earl of Northumberland to Warwick's brother, Lord Montague, but inexplicably, in 1470 gave the title back to the eldest son of the third Earl. Unfortunately, he came to a sticky end in 1489 when he was killed by a mob. By 1550, Warkworth Castle was described as falling into decay, and in 1557 the 6th Earl's nephew, Thomas Percy, was given control of the estates. He apparently used the castle regularly, and a survey taken in 1567 shows it to have been in reasonable repair. Unfortunately, the 7th Earl became involved in the unsuccessful rising of 1569 that attempted to re-establish Roman Catholicism in England, and any further work he had planned for the castle was halted as he was made a prisoner in Scotland, and in July 1572 he was sold to Queen Elizabeth I. He was subsequently executed at York in August of the same year. In 1574 the Queen allowed the 7th Earl's brother, yet another Henry Percy, to assume the title and control of his estates. Unfortunately, a survey that followed showed the castle to be ruinous, with great damage having been done to the buildings due to the looting of metal. That said, some repair work was clearly undertaken as, when the 9th Earl, you guessed it, another Henry, came into possession in 1585, some rooms were clearly habitable. In the early 1600s, Warkworth Castle was leased to Sir Ralph Grey, the owner of nearby Chillingham Castle. He took no interest in the property, however, and let the buildings fall into further disrepair. In response to this, in 1608, the Earl ordered the removal of lead from all of the ruined buildings in the Bailey. When Sir Ralph's lease expired, the Great Tower was being used for the laying out of oats. The history of Warkworth Castle during the English Civil War is somewhat ambiguous. It was garrisoned for the king, but in 1644 it was surrendered to the invading Scots. In 1648, the parliamentarian forces installed a garrison, and the soldiers, upon departure, were instructed to remove doors and iron so that the castle could not be held in war. In 1649, Algernon Percy, 10th Earl of Northumberland, sought recompense for the damage, but none was forthcoming. Gradually, over the next few decades, Warkworth languished as a ruin. For most of the 18th century, the castle was neglected. Various parts were demolished in 1752, and the stone used to build cottages. However, by the end of the century, the remaining buildings were becoming a tourist attraction, helped along by Bishop Percy's popular poem, The Hermit of Warkworth. By now, the Percys, who had been elevated to the Dukedom of Northumberland, began to show a great deal of interest in the property. Some of the demolished parts began to be rebuilt, and clearance of the site began, and, in the 1850s, the 4th Duke Algernon Percy employed architect Anthony Salvin to rebuild the Great Tower. As recently as the early 20th century, a caretaker and his family lived in the castle gatehouse, paying rent to the Duke to graze his sheep and ponies in and around the castle. The castle and hermitage were a holiday attraction for visitors from Newcastle and other towns and villages in the area, and an annual flower show as well as sheepdog trials and carnivals were regularly held there. In 1915, Warkworth Castle was declared a scheduled ancient monument, and in 1922 it was taken into state guardianship. It came into the care of English Heritage in 1984. A castle with so many layers of history must surely have a ghost or two. Well, it is said that a grey lady has been seen pacing around in the great tower. Perhaps Margaret Neville, the wife of the first Earl of Northumberland. The ghost of a young man has also been viewed running along the castle walls. Haunted or not, Warkworth Castle certainly provides an atmospheric peek into Northumberland's long and eventful history.